Hello, I'm Gil Zilka. Welcome back to my channel. This is my series called Essential Classical Music, where we discuss the best recordings of the classical music repertoire. And today, instead of talking about my own choices, in a sense, I'm going to be talking about your choices, or really I should say our choices collectively. This video is going to be about the consensus reference recordings of the core classical repertoire. So it's what we have collectively decided are the reference recordings to go to, the ones that when you're talking around the water cooler with a bunch of classical music geeks about the best recording of the Dvorak Ninth or the Schubert Eighth. People will have their own ideas, and they'll also have sort of a knowledge of what has been passed down from generation to generation. I like to think of it kind of like the Talmud in Judaism, which was a series of rabbinical discussion that was passed from generation to generation. And so it's kind of similar. It really has been going on for about a century, because you go back to around maybe the 1930s when we first started having what you might call a reference recording of a particular work. It might have been the only recording of that work. And then in the decades that followed, you would have 2, 3, 4, and then you would start having these discussions. And actually, I have a little bit of show and tell here. I'm going to show a few of the publications that came out, starting with what might be the granddaddy of them all. This is the Record Guide, first published in 1951. This is the original edition. And the authors are Edward Sackville West and Desmond Shaw Taylor. You might guess they are British. That was sort of the hub of where all this sort of began. And then after this came what really became probably the longest standing of them all, which is the Penguin Guide. This is the Penguin Stereo Record Guide that came out. I think this was the edition that came out in the late 70s. It used to be for records and cassettes, then it became for CDs, and it kept going well into the 2000s. The authors are Edward Greenfield, Robert Layton, and Ivan March. Not to be outdone, we also have some from the United States. This one is the Record Shelf Guide. This edition is from the 90s, from Jim Shveda, well-regarded radio host from California. His show is called The Record Shelf. So we also have some American editions. And then we also have then what became sort of compilations of different editors, different people. So Gramophone magazine had to get into the act. They put out their Good CD Guide, which is sort of their editorial version of the best recordings. You had things like this. This is the Rough Guide to Classical Music, which again is several authors' opinions. A lot of what you find in here is what you hear elsewhere. So it's kind of a conglomeration of opinions that kind of coalesce together. And then you have this one. This is the third ear classical music recording guide, and this is one of the most extensive ones I remember ever coming across. It's pretty thick. It is a little bit uneven. But at its best, it's very informative. They really go in-depth discussions about just about every single recording you can think of. Whereas in some repertoire, it can be a little bit more scant. They'll just kind of run through a bunch of recordings and say, this is good, without giving you much detail. So it's not perfect, but it's one of the most comprehensive guides we've ever had. And then, of course, we have the internet. So that's an entirely different ball game where you have different blogs, different websites. You have forums where people are able to discuss their ideas on what the best recordings are. So that really has accelerated the ability to share and communicate. And even things like the Amazon reviews. I have found those to be very informative. There are some who say that certain people, maybe you who are watching on YouTube, are not qualified to discuss recordings, that we shouldn't care about your opinions. I think that's total hogwash. You don't need a degree to be able to decipher what is a good versus a bad recording. The whole point of all of this is to communicate with the public, with the classical music listening public. So of course your opinions matter. The main point is not whether your opinions matter, it's whether one person's opinion trumps another, whether one is such an expert that that person can just sort of, trump what everyone else says. And that's, sure, there are some people who are better at, certainly there are some, first of all, who have more experience in terms of exposure to tons of recordings. But even a person like that, they can be on the spectrum of listening. They can be in, for example, you might have someone who is more into a recording that conveys the spirit of the music, so-called. They might like a recording that kind of probes more, delves more, maybe a little bit on the slower side in some places, whereas another person might look at that and say, oh, they're just dilly-dallying, the music needs to go, 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 and move. So, you have different preferences based on our personal makeups, who we are as people, without regard to how much experience we might have. Some people might like a pristine recording that is cleanly articulated, perfect intonation, clean recording, whereas another might have such a regard for the emotional aspect, the interpretive aspect, that they believe that trumps considerations in terms of clean sound. So how do you put all of that together into a consensus? You really can't. It is completely an imperfect science. You can, it's kind of like in politics where you have one candidate who might get 40% of the vote, but everyone else gets below 20. So that person wins, and yet 60% of the public did not vote for that person. That's often what is the case. Sometimes you do get some recordings in repertoire that more than often, like you get 80% perhaps might agree, but usually it's not the case. And the best you can do is find which recordings have had the most resonance with the public, to where they've passed the test of time. And you might have a recording that became a reference back in the 30s, and then it kind of dimmed with time as it got replaced decades later. Or maybe it didn't. And maybe then a recording popped up in modern sound that became its own reference, and they sort of are co-chairs. And so a lot of the recordings I'll mention, I just couldn't settle on just one. I had to be honest and say you can't really choose between either one of these in terms of the scuttlebutt through the decades. One story I always like to remember is back in the summer of 1995, I was traveling abroad, and I was at a CD store. And I saw that Deutsche Grammophon had come out with their Originals series, which at that point, I don't believe had yet come out in the US. I certainly had not seen them yet. And so one of the gravest injustices in classical music was corrected. You used to have the Carlos Kleiber Beethoven Fifth and the Beethoven Seventh issued on separate CDs, each comprising less than half a CD, and charging full price for them, because they could get away with that. People still bought it. And so there I was in this store, and I saw that it was released in this original series together, in remastered sound, and at mid-price. And I was like, whoa. So I was curious about, what this remastering process and this originals, and I saw that there were CD guidebooks. Some of them looked fairly new, so I thought maybe they had some comments on them. So I'm looking at the guidebook, and one of the salespeople comes over, and he sees that I'm looking at the recording, and he says, "This is the best one. It's Old Question." And that is sort of the essence of what we're talking about today. These old questions that circulate around the world across generations. And it really is kind of a fun exercise. And lastly, there's the question of the value of this. Obviously, Everyone's not going to agree on one recording. Obviously, just because something is the reference recording doesn't mean you have to like it. At the same time, though, there is a value in it in terms of knowing what it is that has, again, like I said, resonated across time, across generations, and thinking about the reasons. Why is this particular recording so popular? Why are other recordings forgotten over time? At the very least, it gives you a starting point, and you may agree with it, you may not. So, given that, let's go ahead and start. And I'm going to go alphabetically by composer. In general, when I start with the composer, I'll talk first about orchestral music, then chamber music and solo, and then vocal, choral, and opera. So starting with Bach and his orchestral masterpiece, the Brandenburg Concertos. With Bach, that's a case where you look at modern instrument recordings versus the period instrument revolution that came about after 1980. And the question that comes up a lot is, was there a modern reference, and was it replaced or challenged by the period movement? And in this case, I think you can say yes. I think there was sort of a quasi-reference with the Bush chamber players in the 30s. Then you had, you had Lepard, Mariner, Münchener. You had a lot of modern instrument versions. Britten, which is one that I like. But when this recording came out, Trevor Pinnock and the English Concert at the beginning of the 80s, this one really kind of took the throne of the reference version, and opinions sort of coalesced around this period version. So that's an example of how this works. There wasn't a total vacuum, but I would say that there wasn't a recording that kind of elevated to that status until this came along. And I would say that despite the fact there have been many good period recordings since then, including by Pinnock himself, this one I think still holds its status. So we're going to call this the reference for the Brandenburg Concertos. It also, just like that old Bush recording, it's coupled with the orchestral suites as well. So you get all of them in one box. Next, the violin concertos. Now this is a case where we did have what you could call a reference version in modern instruments. And then you've had many really good period recordings after that. But I think the modern instrument one, if there is a reference for the violin concertos, I think this modern instrument recording has held sway. And that's David Oistrakh with his son Igor in the double concerto, conducted by Eugene Goossens from the early 60s. This one I think has held sway, so I'm going to call that the reference for the violin concertos. Now, the cello suites. Here we have, this very famous old version that still holds sway. It still has this haloed position, and that, of course, is Pablo Casals. He was the discoverer of the Bach cello suites. So there's an authority here and our artistic vision that has not been forgotten. But I do think that in the modern era, which is, when I say modern, I'm really talking about mid-50s onward, when we had stereo recordings that had pretty decent sound. I do think we have a modern version that also takes its place next to Casals, and that is Pierre Fournier. His version on Deutsche Grammophon from the early 60s. There's lots of great cello suite recordings. I think this is the one that more often than not you hear about as the reference. So we're going to call these co-references. Now, the violin sonatas and partitas. Here's another example where I couldn't settle on just one. I think there are two that have this iconic status that kind of rivals each other. And it's a little appropriate because they're sort of in contrast in styles. They both, they come within a decade of each other. One comes from the 60s, that's Arthur Grumio. He is sort of the more classical, pristine kind of style. And then you have Nathan Milstein. This is from the early 70s in Deutsche Grammophon, and he's a little bit more of the dramatic virtuosic. Now, Milstein also has a version from the 50s on EMI, and so there's the question of that one versus this one. They're both excellent. I would say I personally I like the EMI one, but I will grant that this one has beautiful sound. So this is really the one that's become the reference for Milstein, and then I'd say both of them for this repertoire. Now, moving on to Bach's organ works. This is one where we have an organist, Helmut Walcha, who was very steeped in Bach. He recorded tons and tons of Bach. And so for a lot of people, specifically for Bach, not just organ works, but keyboard works, he's really looked at as a reference. And he recorded the entire oeuvre of Bach's organ works, which you can get. I like to recommend, if you're wanting just the main works, there's this Deutsche Grammophon double. And this is his stereo recording, so it sounds really good. So this is a reference. But we also cannot forget another organist from the other side of the Atlantic, E. Power Biggs. Well, originally actually from Britain, but then he moved to the United States. He recorded a ton of just in general, tons of organ works. But of course, Bach is the giant among the organ. His album of Bach is also still to this day very acclaimed, and you really cannot, it's as much of a reference as Walcha is specifically, especially in Bach. E. Power Biggs was such a recording giant for the organ. He did so much to help popularize organ music. I think he occupies a place as well. Now, moving to Bach's Goldberg variations. And when you're talking about Bach keyboard, you can either go with harpsichord or piano. I'm not going to differentiate between the two. If it happens to be harpsichord or piano and becomes the reference, I'll just go with that one. This one, like my friend from the record store, it's an old question. This is one of the most famous classical recordings of all time, Glenn Gould. This is his 1981 recording. Really, the big question here is the old Gould versus the younger Gould from the 50s. And there's a lot of debate over that. I could have gone with both of them. But I will say that I think on the whole, there's a touch more acclaim for this later one. So I'm going to stick with that for the Goldberg variations. Now, the well-tempered Clavier. This is one where, like the Bach cello suites, we have an old reference version from the 30s that I think holds its position artistically, and that's from Edwin Fischer on piano. So gone but not forgotten. It still occupies a place. But we also have a version that was recorded in stereo from a renowned pianist that also occupies a haloed position, you might say, and that's from Sviatoslav Richter. This is an RCA recording. Now there's, of course, tons of, both from the old and the new, and a harpsichord and piano. There are tons of great well-tempered claviers. I would say that on the whole, these are the two that you hear the most about still today. All right, now we go to Bach vocal music. I'm going to start with his most famous cantata, number 82, Ich habe genug. And for this one, we have an old standard that I think still occupies its place alone, and that is Hans Hotter. Mostly known for his Wagner, but he also was a wonderful lieder singer, and as he proved with this recording from the 50s, he can do wonderful Bach. So this one, I think, even though the sound is older, although it's fairly good mono sound, this one has held its place. Now we come to his two towering choral masterpieces, the Mass in B minor and the St. Matthew Passion. And in both of these works, I think we do have a case where we have the modern instrument reference version and a newer period performance reference version. For the Mass in B minor, I'm going to go with Karl Richter and the Münchener Bach Chor and Orchestra. Richter was, of course, very well known for his recordings of Bach choral works, and here he had Maria Stader, Ernst Häflinger, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, some of his soloists. And it's just a very successful recording that has held sway even still today. However, we then have a period performance which really dominated from the 80s onwards, and that is John Eliot Gardner with the Monteverdi Choir and English Baroque soloists. This one, Gardner recorded pretty much all of Bach's choral works, his cantatas. Then he's come out with recordings even after that. And even though there are a lot of wonderful, other wonderful period versions, this is the one that really has kind of coalesced most critical opinion. Now, for the St. Matthew Passion, for the modern instrument reference version, I could have also gone with Richter on that one, but I think there is another one that, especially still today, you just still hear talked about, even though it's a little bit controversial because of its tempos, and that's Klemperer with the Philharmonia. This one is the definition of old school. It's very well recorded, but it makes a kind of a perfect contrast with the period instrument version in that sense. It's just the one that you still hear the most about when people are talking about modern instrument versions of the St. Matthew Passion. And then, again, in the period field, I would say that the Gardner version, maybe not quite as much as the Mass in B minor. There's a little bit more competition here, I would say, from like Harnoncourt and Hereweg, if you're talking about which one is the reference. I think on the whole, Gardner is still the one that gets the most mention. Okay, so that's Bach. Now let's move to Bartok and his orchestral works, the Concerto for Orchestra and the Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celesta. I'm not going to spend too much time here because you all know what the reference recording is. Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony, very well recorded in the late 50s. And it's not, obviously, nothing is unanimous. I had a different choice on my own video for best versions of these works, but this is the one that has held sway as the reference. Now, the Bartok string quartets. This one is tougher. In general, it's tougher with chamber music. It's a field that it's not quite as heavily debated because it's not quite as popular as orchestral or opera, and you don't have, generally speaking, it's not, you don't always have your go-to group. And for the Bartok string quartets, it's particularly difficult because you have, from the decades previous, you have the Juilliard Quartet, you have the Vague Quartet, the Hungarian Quartet did a wonderful version. And looking, if I was to just stop there, it would be very difficult for me to figure out which one of those really held sway over the others, until we got to the late 90s and a version showed up that became sort of the critical darling, and that's this one, the Takash Quartet on Decca. So this is the one, this is an example where you can have a newer recording that becomes a reference. And even though it's still, I think, very debatable between different versions, I think if there is a reference for the Bartok string quartets, this is the one. Okay, so now we come to one of the most hotly debated of all, Beethoven, especially the Beethoven symphonies. And this is where you get into questions of different styles, different orchestras, Europe versus America. And starting with Symphony number 3, the Eroica, this is almost a perfect litmus test for different styles. And I'm going to start with the two conductors who have most often been pitted against each other in terms of philosophical debate, Toscanini and Furtwängler. And I'm going to start with both of their versions. These are live versions from with Toscanini, it's 1939 with the NBC Symphony, and Furtwängler, this is 1944 with the Vienna Philharmonic. Both of these, I think you have to talk about, especially in terms of the interpretation. Obviously, the sound is older, especially since it's like live recordings. But very different approaches, but they're both considered essential for the Eroica. Now, you then had some better recorded studio recordings coming out later that, interestingly enough, I'm going to say there's two more reference recordings for the Eroica. And you might say one of them is closer to the Furtwängler approach. That would be Klemperer. This is his 1955 mono version with the Philharmonia. Personally, I prefer the one that was recorded a few years later in stereo. But in general, I'd say just by a little bit, the people still prefer the mono version, which is a little bit swifter. And then you have, from the other side of the Atlantic, you have the version that is closer to the Toscanini style. That's George Zell with the Cleveland Orchestra. So there you go, 4 reference versions for the Eroica. I just can't really delete any of these from the list. So here you go. This is your Mount Rushmore of Eroicas. Okay, so moving to the 5th. This one's much easier, of course. Carlos Kleiber with the Vienna Philharmonic, one of the most famous classical recordings of all time. Now, as I was saying, it was then coupled with the 7th, which was long overdue, with the Deutsche Grammophon originals. The 7th has never been quite as popular as the 5th in critical circles, although it still tends to rise to the top. And you know, one of the reasons might be that it's riding the coattails of the 5th. Although he did do a live version that came out on Orfeo that is also very well regarded. So he still did a very good version of the 7th. But for the 7th, I will say that there is a older granddaddy version, which I think we can say maybe co-chairs on the 7th at least, and that is Toscanini's version from 1936 with the New York Philharmonic. So we'll put them together for the 7th, but for the 5th, Carlos Kleiber holds pride of place. Now, let's talk about the 6th Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony. And in this case, we have a conductor whose name is almost synonymous with the work. Anytime that happens, that kind of screams reference recording. And that, of course, is Bruno Walter. This is his late 50s recording with the Columbia Symphony. However, there's another recording from the other side of the Atlantic that has such acclaim and is so widely praised that I have to give that one its due as well. That's Karl Böhm with the Vienna Philharmonic. So we're going to call Walter and Böhm co-chairs with the Pastoral Symphony. Now let's go to the 9th. With the 9th, I'm going to start with, just like I was talking about with the Pastoral, the conductor whose name is almost synonymous with the work. I mean, his career is almost embedded in the work, even though he never did a studio recording. And that, of course, is Wilhelm Furtwängler. And this is the recording that really is the one that has, through the decades, been looked at as his reference recording of the 9th. That's the Bayreuth recording, recorded in 1951 at the reopening of the Bayreuth Festival. The sound is not, it's a little bit murky. The choir especially sounds recessed. But for Furtwängler's interpretation, this has usually been the go-to, even though there are others, and I talk about them in my video of the 9th. Now, despite that, not everyone loves Furtwängler, and definitely not everyone loves old sound, especially for a work like the Beethoven 9th. So the question then is, what is the studio version that holds its place with the 9th? Well, the conductor who really, if anyone dominated the field once we got into stereo, that would be Furtwänger's successor with the Berlin Philharmonic, and that's Herbert von Karajan. This is the crowning achievement of his cycle that came out in the 1960s, and still today is looked at as a reference. However, this is going to be probably the only time in this entire series that I talk about not just a co-chair, but a co-chair with the same exact conductor and orchestra. His 1970s version is also favored by many critics, to the point where I can't really make an argument for one over the other in terms of critical consensus. So I'm just going to put them both in. My preference is for the 70s one. But you still have a lot of adherence to the one from the 60s. Certainly the Quartet of Soloist is fantastic. So 2 Karajans make the grade. And then we have an interesting situation where we have a version that for the longest time I would say was overshadowed by Karajan. But in the last couple of decades especially, as word is circulated around the internet, this version has really taken its place as well, despite the fact that it's older than the Karajan. And that's Ferenc Fritzsche with Karajan's orchestra, the Berlin Philharmonic. This one lately has really become the one that has become more of the darling of vintage versions of the Ninth. So here we go again. 4 recordings that form a sort of Mount Rushmore of reference versions of the Beethoven Ninth. Okay, so that is Beethoven. That's the Beethoven Symphonies. Now let's move on to the concertos, starting with the 4th piano concerto. Now, anytime you're talking about Beethoven and piano and the concertos, there's just a slew of fantastic versions, and I've covered them in my videos. But I think with the 4th, there is one version that tends to get mentioned more and has taken its place as sort of the proverbial cream of the crop, and that's this one. Emil Galels, conducted by Leopold Ludwig with the Philharmonia. This is from the 50s. And it may not have been the reference, back in the 60s and 70s, but certainly with the advent of CD, and now we have, like Testament is reissuing things. I think finally EMI also put this out again. This is the one that you get most mention of for the 4th. Now they did record the 5th as well, and it's coupled here, but I think for the 5th we have a different reference version, and this is a stereo version from the 60s. Leon Fleischer with George Zell and the Cleveland Orchestra. A ton of great Emperor concertos, but I think this is the one that gets most widely praised. So I'm gonna put this as the sole reference for that. For the violin concerto, again, a lot of great competition on this one, going all the way back to like Fritz Kreisler and Bronislaw Huberman. But for this one, we have a early digital recording that is so widely praised that I think this one can be counted now as the reference, and that is Itzhak Perlman, conducted by Carlo Maria Giulini with the Philharmonia. I talk about this in my video on the Beethoven Violin Concerto. It's a beautiful version, and so despite the fact that there's tons of competition, and I could have listed 2 or 3 more, I'm going to say this is our reference now for the Violin Concerto. Okay, now we come to chamber music, the Beethoven String Quartets. This is one where, kind of like with the Pablo Casal's Bach cello suites, we have a granddaddy reference version, which is still today, for its artistic insights, still looked back on with reverence, really, and that's the Busch Quartet from the 30s. Now, it's not complete. They recorded all of the late quartets as well as the Serioso, the first quartet of the Opus 18, and I think 1 or 2 of the Razumovsky quartets. But at least it's got the late quartets in there. And the main thing is it still holds this position because of the artistic insights. Now that said, you do probably want a complete set and one in stereo, and we do have one that has by a thin margin. There's lots of competition in this repertoire, but I think by the thinnest of margins, this one has taken its place next to the bush, and that is the Vague Quartet. It's a little harder to find, it's a little bit expensive, but this is one that is widely acclaimed for its artistic insights as well. Okay, now let's talk about his piano trio, the Archduke, his most famous piano trio. And this is one where we have a version from way back in the late 1920s. And that's from Alfred Cortot on piano, Jacques Thibault on violin, and Pablo Casals on cello. My uncle told me about how my grandfather used to play the 78 of this recording. It was one of his favorite recordings, so that's kind of a cool memory to hear about secondhand. But it also kind of goes to show the reverence with which this recording was held. And again, with chamber music, it's a little harder to find reference recordings, especially chamber groups as opposed to a soloist. Now we do, however, have a powerhouse piano trio group that did record it in stereo that takes its place next to this one, and that is, of course, the Beaux-Arts trio. This is the recording from the mid-60s. Incidentally, I got to hear the Archduke trio just a few blocks away from my house here at the Jewish Community Center. Menachem Pressler, the pianist for the Beaux-Arts trio, came and performed the Archduke trio. And hearing a work like the Archduke trio performed by its reference version pianist, that's always kind of thrilling. So thank you, Menachem, for that. So that is the Archduke trio. Now let's talk about the Violin Sonata number 9, the Kreutzer Sonata. And this is one where we have a lot of wonderful versions, especially from way back with some of the great violinists. But I think we do have a stereo version that has taken its place as the reference. And that's Yitzhak Perlman and Vladimir Ashkenazy from the early 70s. So we're lucky that this is one that's very well recorded and it's considered the reference. So there you go for the Kreutzer. Now let's talk about the piano sonatas. We have to start with the granddaddy of them all, one of the granddaddies of all classical music recordings, and that's, of course, Arthur Schnabel. Recorded it in the 30s, and still to this day, anyone who is studying the Beethoven piano sonatas or just investigating them, despite the infamous flubs here and there, in terms of artistic insight, Schnabel is still held, in very high regard. And then the question was, is there anyone after Schnabel who recorded it in better sound and also retains a similar position? And I think the answer to that is yes, and that is Wilhelm Kempff. The big debate here is between his mono and his stereo versions. It is piano, so it's a single instrument. It's a little bit easier to record obviously in mono. You're not coordinating different instruments together. I would say that critical consensus goes with the mono version. So I'm going to call that one the reference for Kempff. Now, as an aside, Emil Galels died before he could complete his cycle. I think if he had completed it, that probably would have become the reference for stereo recordings at least. But alas, still he did leave us the bulk of the sonatas behind, which are excellent versions. All right, so that is piano. One more Beethoven work to talk about, and that is his choral masterpiece, the Missa Solemnis. This one's a little difficult. I think there are a lot of candidates here going all the way back to Toscanini. You have Karajan, Leonard Bernstein left a couple of really good versions. But I'm going to say that on the whole, by just a little hair, the one that gets mentioned the most as the reference for this is the Klemperer version from the late 60s, I believe it was, with the New Philharmonia Orchestra and Chorus. That's the one that probably on the whole is the reference for the Missa Solemnis, if there is a single reference. Okay, so that's Beethoven. Now let's move to Berlioz, starting with the orchestral masterpiece Symphonie Fantastique. And for this one, I think we can safely say the one that has gotten most mention over the decades is this one from the early 70s with Colin Davis and the Concertgebouw. Very well recorded, and even though he also re-recorded it, and there are other versions, I've talked about in my video, I think by just a little bit, this is the one that still gets the most mention. And then let's talk about Berlioz's masterpiece for soprano and orchestra, and that is the Les Nuits d'été, the Summer Nights. And this version, Régine Crespin and Ernest Ansermet with the La Suisse Romande, this is the one that, even though it's not, singers, it's always a big debate. It's a very personal thing, so it's not universally loved by any stretch. But I think on the whole, this is the one that over the decades has been the most sort of, referential version of all. Okay, so now let's talk about Bizet's Carmen. Finally, we're talking about an opera. And this is one that it's kind of a crapshoot. Obviously, it's been recorded a ton. I would say that compared to other operas, this is one that has not really had that one version that everyone just automatically, says, oh, of course, this. You've had Reiner recorded it with Rise Stevens. Bernstein did it with Marilyn Horne. You had versions with Abbado, Karajan, Menegas Johnson with Lauren Mizell conducting. The one that I would say is the closest we have to a reference version, though, is this one, conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham with Victoria de Los Angeles as Carmen. And it's got the French Radio National Orchestra as well to lend that French touch. And of course, Beecham was known as a very good French conductor and conductor of Bizet. So that kind of helped the cause and kind of nudging this above the competition. So I would say on the whole, it's certainly not unanimous by any stretch. This is the closest we have to a reference for Carmen. All right, now let's talk about Brahms. Starting with the symphonies. And for the symphonies, compared to Beethoven, I would say the symphonies, it's a little bit more straightforward. You may not agree, but I feel pretty secure in these as references, starting with the first, Klemperer, with the Philharmonia, recorded in the late 50s. Those pounding strokes at the beginning almost seem tailor-made for Klemperer. And this one is, he was known for all the Brahms symphonies, but I think especially this one. And so I would say that this one has held sway. And then for the second and the third, by the way, you ever notice how the four Brahms symphonies, they almost are like the four movements of a symphony, in that the outer movements are the more sort of dramatic, and then you have the middle two symphonies are almost like your Adagio and Andante. I always found that kind of interesting. And so appropriately enough, the second and the third symphonies, the reference version is from that gentleman of all gentlemen's Bruno Walter with the Columbia Symphony. Pretty much universally praised, these recordings. And again, he also did well in all the Brahms symphonies, but I think these two are the standouts and aptly coupled together in this CD issue. And then for the fourth, I don't think there's a lot of debate in terms of what the reference is. There may be some debate over whether it deserves that status from some, but the reference for this one is, again, just like the Beethoven 5th and 7th, Carlos Kleiber, his recording with the Vienna Philharmonic. So that is the symphonies. I think that one is pretty straightforward. Now, the piano concertos, this one you might consider to also not be much of a debate, but it's really a question of whether you stick with one or you expand the definition of reference to include many others. I'm just going to stick with the one obvious choice for this one, and that is, of course, Emil Gilels with Eugen Joachim and the Berlin Philharmonic from the early 70s. Classic since the day it was made, and as many great other versions as there have been, and I discussed them in my video on the best recordings. This one has sort of cast a shadow over everything before and since. So I'm going to count this as our reference for the piano concertos. Now the violin concerto. And when you're talking about violin concertos, think of it kind of like the Brady Bunch, but instead of Marsha, 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 it's Yasha, Yasha, Yasha. I'm talking, of course, about Jascha Heifetz. He dominates the field of violin concertos, and it's interesting because he can be a little polarizing in some ways. One of the, maybe the most technically gifted violinist that ever recorded, and yet he's not always everyone's cup of tea. He tended to play things in quick tempos, faster than the norm often, so it could be controversial. But this is a case where his recordings are such an event, and especially the ones that we got in stereo, which really sound, you get to hear them in really good sound. And so this is one of those cases where his recording with Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony from the mid-50s definitely has to be among at least one of the references for the Brahms concerto. And what we might also start to see as we go along is that you have the Heifetz and then you have the not Heifetz. And it's a question of who is the not Heifetz, or is there one? And I think in the case of the Brahms concerto, there is one. There's a violinist who was very well known for his many recordings, both studio and live, and that is David Oistrakh. The question is, which one do you choose? The earlier one from the 50s with Konwiczny on Deutsche Grammophon, the later one with George Zell. He also did one with Kirill Kondrashin on Melodia. I'm going to say that the one with Klemperer from, I believe, like 1960 is the one that gets the most mention among Oistrakh recordings. So here you go, Heifetz and Oistrakh together for the Brahms concerto. Okay, so now let's talk about chamber music for Brahms. And again, this is a more difficult area. It's a little bit more difficult to pinpoint a reference, and more often than not, we're just sort of having to pick one that is maybe more mentioned than others. In this case, we do have a version that is sort of your granddaddy version that I think still holds a place artistically, and that's this one, if I can pull the right CD. With Reginald Kell on clarinet and the Bush Quartet. This is from the late 30s. Still occupies a position that I think you still have to count it as one of the references at least. And then the question is, do we have a modern reference? It's a little bit tougher with this piece to settle on one, but I think there is one that you can choose at least based on the clarinetist, and that is Carl Leister, the principal clarinetist for the Berlin Philharmonic for many years. He recorded it many times, and what you often hear is, get one of the Leisters, is what people say. So he had one from the 60s with the Amadeus Quartet. He kept recording it all through the 90s. I would say that the one that I've heard the most get praise, and justifiably, it's a very good recording, is this one with the Leipzig String Quartet. It's on the MD, the MDR label, I think it's called. So it's not as easy to find. But I want to reiterate, this is not a situation where we're talking about what is the recording that has the most sales or is the easiest to get. What we're talking about is the collective scuttlebutt of the people in the know, including you people watching, and what's the recording, even if it's the one that that's most difficult to find in some cases, that stands out the most as a reference. And I think among Leisters, this is the one that you hear about the most. Okay, and finally, for chamber works, let's also talk about Brahms's popular piano quintet. This one's a little bit difficult to center on one, but I think if there is one, it would be this. Arthur Rubinstein and the Guarneri Quartet, coupled with the Schumann piano quintet. Spoiler alert. This one's definitely a very good version, but there are a lot of other really good ones as well. So it's not as obvious for that reason. But I think if you were going to center on one that occupies a reference position, it would be this. And then finally for Brahms, let's talk about Ein Deutsches Requiem, the German Requiem. And this one's pretty clear in terms of what the reference is. Otto Klemper with the Philharmonia and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, your dream team soloists. This one has really pretty much occupied the reference position since it was first recorded. So not much question there. Okay, next, let's talk about Bruch and his violin concerto, his first violin concerto, the popular one. And again, we got our Jascha. Where is he? Here he is. Here he is, recorded in the early 60s, so a pretty good sounding recording with Sir Malcolm Sargent. This is one where I think this one has dominated the field so much, I'm going to just put Jascha alone in this case with the Bruch Concerto. He is the reference recording. And now we come to Bruckner Symphonies. And this, kind of like the Brahms, I was surprised at how easy this was. And not easy in terms of if you're talking about what the best version is. Again, we're just talking about the reference version. It's not that difficult to single out which ones have gotten the most critical mention. Starting with the fourth, that one is Karl Böhm with the Vienna Philharmonic. And you're going to notice a theme here, Vienna Philharmonic. Because guess what? With the seventh and the eighth, we also have Herbert von Karajan with the Vienna Philharmonic and with the Vienna Philharmonic. Now, there is some debate here about whether it should be his earlier versions with the Berlin Philharmonic, which actually I like both of those better. But if you're being honest about the collective scuttlebutt, it's really these Vienna versions, especially in the case of the eighth, which a lot of people consider to be one of Karajan's greatest recordings ever. These are sort of his valedictory, late 80s versions. So, and of course they're recorded very well. So those are the ones that have gotten the most mention for both the seventh and the eighth. And then again, we had the Vienna Philharmonic for the ninth. Carlo Maria Giulini. This is my favorite version, incidentally. It's just overwhelming. And it's the one I think we can safely say has also gotten the plethora of critical acclaim. So that was Bruckner. Surprisingly straightforward. Now we move next to Chopin. And I could have gone the easy route here and just said Rubinstein. That would be the knee-jerk thing, right? Certainly if you're talking about a complete set of Chopin, I think you could say Rubinstein. But I prefer to separate out. First of all, I'm not going to cover all of his piano works. I'm going to cover the most popular sets of pieces, and there really are individual recordings that stand out the most. Starting with the ballades, where the recording of choice is, in fact, Rubinstein. His RCA recording, recorded, I believe it was the early 60s. And there's lots of other really good ballad recordings too, but I think this one still occupies its place at the top. Now for the etudes, there's a version by another pianist, Maurizio Pollini, that is just, fantastic virtuosity that really comes as close as we have seen to sweeping the board in this repertoire. However, for the nocturnes, this one I have to go back to Rubinstein. This is, as an individual recording, this is one of Rubinstein's most acclaimed, and really the biggest competition is maybe himself, his recordings from the 30s that are released on EMI. Very, very famous, and one of the for me, one of the first sets that I recommend to people exploring Chopin for the first time. Then we have the preludes, and I'm gonna combine them with the impromptus, which often they are combined together. I guess partly because they can all fit together on a disc. And this one, I'm going to go back to a really old version from the 30s, Alfred Cortot. Cortot was a Chopin master. Even though he's again one of those where he's more on the side of the type of artist who's probing and maybe does things in an individual way and not always immaculate technically, the artistry is what carries the day. And I would say that for these works, I would say that in terms of a reference version, he's still unchallenged today. I don't think there is one that has really come along that really replaces a Quartet. So I'm going to keep just Quartet. It is 30s sound, but it's a single piano, so it's a little bit easier to record with older technology. Now for the valses, I say valses, waltzes. This isn't German. The waltzes. There's another older recording that I think still holds sway today, and that, of course, is Dino Lipati. This is a very famous recording. Does a wonderful job with the valses. So, pretty easy choice, I think, for the reference for that. Now, Copland and his masterpiece, Appalachian Spring. This one's pretty straightforward, right? It's got to be Leonard Bernstein in a New York Philharmonic from the early 60s. He re-recorded it himself, but I think this is the one that has held sway as the reference version. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's move on now to Debussy and his orchestral music. I'm just going to talk about his two most famous works, La Mer and Prélude à la Prémédie d'Enfant. And for this one, it's a little bit more murky. I think there's a lot of debate over this. There's a lot of versions you could choose. But first, the one that really stands out as one that kind of came to the fore is this one from the mid-60s. Herbert von Karajan with the Berlin Philharmonic, very lushly performed and recorded, which maybe is part of the controversy for some who don't like the interpretation. But regardless, it certainly has garnered critical acclaim and held that position since. However, there's another version which also occupies a high place with critics still today, which is a little bit, compared to Karajan, maybe a little bit less on the lush side, so maybe it complements the Karajan well. And that is Bernard Haitink from the 70s with the Concertgebouw. So I'm going to say these are two co-chairs for this repertoire. Then moving on to the Debussy and the Ravel string quartets. This is a case where you have two works from different composers that are combined together in recordings so often that you can just call it one thing. There's only one other case where I'm going to discuss that'll be the Grieg and Schumann piano concertos. And in this case, again, string quartet repertoire, it's a little bit more difficult. There's been a ton of great recordings of these works. And I almost want to punt and say there is no reference. But I do think there is one that has stood out probably more than others since it was recorded, and that is this one, the Quartetto Italiano from the mid-60s. So I'm going to say that is our reference for the Debussy and Ravel string quartets. Now let's move on to his piano music, and this one is kind of a slam dunk in critical circles, and that's Walter Gieseking. This was recorded in the 50s. It was in mono, I think. I'm not sure if all of it was mono. It might have been partly mono or mostly mono, but it's a fairly old recording, but it's with piano, so it's not that bad. But Gieseking was considered the Debussy master, and this is a pretty easy choice if you're identifying a reference version. Now let's move to Antonin Dvorak and his two most popular symphonies, the 8th and the 9th. And this one I think is a fairly easy choice too, and that is this recording from the early 70s. Raphael Kubelik with the Berlin Philharmonic. He recorded an entire cycle, but for the last two symphonies, Deutsche Grammophon, they released them together in their originals series, smart thinking, because these are, on the whole, the most highly regarded versions of these popular works. Now for his cello concerto, there are, I think, I was debating this one, whether to go with one or two, and I think at the end of the day, I really couldn't make a case for one of these not being a reference, and that is, first of all, Pierre Fournier with George Zell and the Berlin Philharmonic, and then Herbert von Karajan, he's the conductor, Mstislav Rostropovich, the cellist, with the Berlin Philharmonic. Both of these are from the 60s. Two of the, if not the two premier cellists of their time, at least on recording. And one of these is more kind of on the taut side, the Fournier Zell, and one of these is more on the lugubrious, sort of mellow, slower side. So maybe they complement each other well in that regard. I think they can both be counted as the reference. And next, let's talk about his chamber masterpiece, the String Quartet Number 12, the American Quartet. And this one's just really tough. Again, string quartet repertoire is not as recorded. There have been many really good recordings. If I was to go with just the most easily available, that would be the Prague Quartet on Deutsche Grammophon. But if you listen to the Scuttlebutt, that's not the one that's most often favored. Now, which one is? That's a harder question. I'm actually going to go with one that is the opposite of the Prague in terms of availability. It's really difficult to find this one, partly because the record label is no longer around. And that's this one, the Talich Quartet. This was recorded in the late 70s. There are other versions that you could also include as reference versions, but I think this is the one that just by a little bit, you get a little bit more across the board critical acclaim, and it's definitely very, very good, very recommendable as are others. All right, so now we come to Elgar and his cello concerto, and this one's fairly straightforward. Jacqueline Dupre and John Barbaroli. This was with the London Symphony, I think. Yeah. One of the most famous classical recordings of all time. Another case where the artist is almost synonymous with the work, so really nothing else to say there. And then for Elgar's Enigma variations, this one I'm going to go with Adrian Bolt. This is also with the London Symphony. This was recorded in 1970. And this one's coupled on CD with his Holst Planets. So the question is, will he also be the reference for that? Inquiring minds want to know. We'll see. Next, let's go to Gabriel Fauré and his choral masterpiece, his Requiem. This one's a little bit difficult to find one that really sticks out as a reference. I could have gone with Cliton, his version, which had Victoria de Los Angeles and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as the soloists. That one is definitely a very famous version, but I would say that this later version by John Rutter with the Cambridge Singers kind of eclipsed that one in terms of critical praise and has held that position since. So I'm going to stick with this one. For our next composer, who's also a Frenchman, César Franck, I'm going to talk about his chamber masterpiece, the Violin Sonata. The Franck Violin Sonata. What a beautiful piece. It kind of vies with the Beethoven Kreutzer Sonata in terms of most popular violin sonatas. And this is one where we do have a granddaddy version, and that's with, appropriately enough, the French artists Jacques Thibault on violin and Alfred Cortot on piano. This was recorded in 1929, so it's very old, but still artistically considered, you got to hear this one. So the question is there a modern version which can also take its place? And that's a difficult question because there have been a lot of really good, really highly regarded modern versions. Perlman Ashkenazi is one that I easily could have included, but I think just by the hair of her chinny chin chin, Kyung-Hwa Chung, in her late 70s recording with Radu Lupu, gets the prize for stereo recordings of the Franck Violin Sonata in terms of critical praise. So I'm going to go with that one. And now we come to George Gershwin and the Rhapsody in Blue, coupled as often it is with an American in Paris. This one, I'm going to say that for the most part, the one that gets the most critical mention as the classic version is this one. Leonard Bernstein with the Columbia Symphony in the Rhapsody in Blue and the New York Philharmonic in the American in Paris. They were recorded, I believe it was the late 50s, like around 1959. And the Rhapsody in Blue can be played in so many different ways. More classical as it is here, or kind of a little bit more jazzy. So it's difficult to center on one reference. But according to our definition, in terms of what has gotten the most airplay in the in the water cooler discussion, I would say that probably more the Bernstein a little bit more. Now we come to the Grieg and Schumann piano concertos. And this one I found to be very difficult. Unlike, for example, let's say the Brahms piano concertos, where we have a slam dunk, easy, good sounding recording from Gilels and Jochum that has been the classic. I don't think you can say the same of this set of concertos. And really, when it came down to it, I had to look at what recording more consistently than others gets critical praise and critical attention as this is a reference version, and I would say it's this version from the 40s, Dino Lipati, both with the Philharmonia. Aceo Galliera is the conductor for the Grieg, and Karajan is the conductor for the Schumann. This one is impeccable artistically. Really, the big question is just about the sound. Otherwise, it would be more like a slam dunk. Obviously it is older sound quality, but I just can't center on it. We have Lupu, Pariah, Kovacevic. We've had a lot of really highly regarded versions since this one, but I don't think we've had any that really can say that's the modern reference above all others. So I'm just going to stick with Lipati for these. All right, now we come to Handel and his orchestral masterworks, the Water Music and Music for the Royal Fireworks. And just like with Bach, you have the question of modern instruments, and then you have the period instrument revolution, and was there a modern reference? Did it get replaced, and so on. I think in this case, just like with the Brandenburg concertos, the version from Trevor Pinnock with the English concert is the one that just barely, with all apologies to Christopher Hogwood, I think the Pinnock is the one that has gotten the most praise and has managed to eclipse as well all the modern instrument versions that came before it. So I'm going to go with Pinnock for this one. And then for his choral masterwork, The Messiah, this is a question, again, we have a lot of great modern instrument versions. Beecham is one I could have easily gone with. And then in the period instrument field, you have again Pinnock and again Hogwood. But I'm going to say that I'm going to center on just one for this one. That's the one that kind of came in between the others as sort of your modern instrument scaled down version that really caused a sensation when it was released in the 70s. And that's Colin Davis. I believe it's the London Symphony and Chorus. And this one, it's sort of a perfect middle ground version between the modern instrument and the period instruments. And I think by a small margin, because there's so many highly regarded versions of the Messiah, I think this one can be called the reference. And next, let's talk about Handel's operatic masterpiece, Julius Caesar. Baroque opera is sort of late to the party among operas compared to, Italian romantic operas, but it's really, especially in modern times, become much more popular. And for this opera, we had a fabulous version from the 60s starring Beverly Sills. But for this one, there's a recording from the 80s that I think has held sway enough to where it can be considered the reference, and really a good gateway to Baroque opera in general. And that's with the one conducted by Renee Jacobs, with Jennifer Larmore as Cesare and Barbara Schlick as Cleopatra. It's with the Concerto Cologne. Period instruments, of course, and just a really iconic Baroque opera recording still to this day. Although there's a lot of really good versions the last couple of decades, coming out. I would say in general, there's that question of, can you have a modern reference recording as if it's something that's impossible? Well, no. I mean, it's meaning no, it's not impossible. You could have a recording of the Beethoven Ninth that came out today and was just so universally overwhelming to people that it eclipsed all that came before it. In theory. In practice, it's just a little bit harder, but particularly so with the Romantic repertoire. I would say if there's one bit of repertoire that I would say the Baroque and the Renaissance especially is an area where the modern ensembles are the ones who sort of are really the most innovative and have the best chance of giving us a modern reference. And so even something from the 80s, which is now almost 40 years old, that's considered a modern reference recording. Okay, so that's Handel. Now let's move to Haydn, and we'll cover his London symphonies, the final 12, his most popular. And this one I think is a fairly clear reference in terms of getting the most mention, and that is Colin Davis with the Concertgebouw. Recorded fairly well in the 70s. There are other wonderful versions, Jochum, Beecham, and then I talk about those versions in my videos. But I think if you're talking about one that has gotten more often than not critical mention as a reference, it would be this one. And then again we come to the field of chamber music. and I'm going to talk about his Opus 76 string quartets. His most popular and one of the greatest sets of string quartets ever written, especially the Emperor and the Sunrise. It's really difficult to pinpoint one recording. I would say if there is a reference for this, it might be this one from the 60s, the Tetrai Quartet. And part of it might have been that they were sort of the first really famous version, but artistically they're still critically praised to this day, even though they're hard to find. It's the Hungaroton label, but I think these, by just a little bit, I think you can say that if there's a reference for these quartets, it would be this one. And then next, we have something which is not difficult at all, the Creation. This one has a very obvious reference, and it's Karajan's version with the Berlin Philharmonic and Vienna Singverein, and a slew of fantastic soloists, Gundula Janowitz, Fritz Wunderlich, Walter Berry as Raphael. We also have Fischer Dieskau and Christa Ludwig if you need them. So just a star-studded cast and a very obvious reference recording. Okay, now we come to Holst and the planets and revisiting that question of Adrian Boult, who recorded the planets many times. So if you were going to define reference by, who has that authority of, knowing the composer, like he was sitting next to the composer as he wrote it, taking notes, so that we often think of certain conductors having that kind of authority. Is he the authority for the planets? I will say no, it's this one. Charles Dutoit and the Montreal Symphony. This came out in the 80s. It definitely helped that with a work like this, it was digitally recorded, so the sound quality is fantastic. I would say that this one is the one that after it came out is so critically praised that it became the new reference. So I'm going to stick with just Dutoit for the planets. Now we come to a Renaissance composer finally, Josquin des Prez, one of the greatest of all Renaissance composers. And I'm just going to talk about his most popular work. And that is the Mass Missa Pangelingua. And I'm going to go with, this will be kind of boring, but I'm going to go with the acme of Renaissance groups, the Tallis Scholars, their famous recording from the 80s. Even though among Renaissance geeks, I'm sure this will spar a lot of debate, but in terms of what gets most widely critically praised, it's this version, which really is gorgeous. It's one of the most famous recordings of Renaissance music out there. Next, let's go to the Romantic era, Franz Liszt, and his Piano Concerto No. 1, which is his most popular of the two, although often they're recorded together as a set, or you might have just No. 1 by itself. In this case, I'm going to say this recording of the two of them together is sort of the obvious choice as the reference, and that is, of course, Sviatoslav Richter with Kirill Kondrashin and the London Symphony. Wonderful recording quality. Pretty much a slam dunk in terms of reference recording. Now we come to one which is maybe a little bit more difficult, and I would say this is Liszt's masterpiece, the Piano Sonata. I'm going to start with one, the Granddaddy version from the virtuoso of all virtuosos, Vladimir Horowitz. Thankfully, he gave us this recording of the Liszt Sonata, which does full justice to this masterwork. And definitely still holds a haloed place among sonata recordings. And so again, this is a question of, do we have a modern version that can at least go toe-to-toe with that one and also be a reference version? And I would say there's a lot of competition. Arau did a really good one. Clifford Cozone. There was a live version that Richter did that was released in the 90s, which partly on the coattails of his Piano Concertos recording. Now that has a lot of circulation. But I think the one that has gotten the most play in terms of critical praise in the modern era is Martha Argerich. This is from her debut recital. And you know what? Maybe, this is a psychological thing, but maybe this would be seen as more of a slam dunk reference if it actually said on the title, Liszt Piano Sonata. And then including other works. Instead, it's debut recital, so it's focused more on the artist, so it tends to get filed in the artist section. So in the old days, when people went looking in Liszt, they would often not even find this. It's a little, subtle thing, but sometimes it can make a difference. But I think among, critical appraisals, I think this virtuosic display from Argerich is the one that gets most mentioned with the Liszt Sonata next to the Horowitz version. Okay, now we come to Mahler. And you would think there would be a lot of debate with Mahler, but actually, in terms of reference versions, the ones that have, gotten the most mention, risen to the top of the scuttlebutt, it's a little bit more straightforward than you might think, especially with the first, this very famous version from Raphael Kubelik with the Bavarian Radio Symphony, pretty much a classic since it was made. Not much debate there, really. And then for the second, we have a conductor who recorded it once in the studio. We have a few live versions as well. And he's sort of considered almost synonymous with the work, and that's Klemperer. This is his 1962 Philharmonia version. Elizabeth Schwarzkopf is the soprano soloist, and it's pretty much held sway as the reference since then, even though there are a lot of other really great Mahler seconds, not to mention his contemporary Bruno Walter as well. Now for the third. I'm going to say for the third, this one's maybe a little bit less straightforward. I'm going to say that we have two references, and they come from opposite sides of the Atlantic. One is Leonard Bernstein. I would say this is really he did wonderful Mahler, of course. He did two cycles, the New York Philharmonic from the 60s and the one from the 80s that was a little bit patched together. But I would say from his earlier cycle, this is really the cream of the crop, his third, recording of the third. And it's also very much a reference recording for the work. However, there's another recording from the other side of the Atlantic that you just still hear about every time you are discussing the great versions, and that's Jascha Horenstein with the London Symphony, recorded in 1970. It's a smaller label, it's the unicorn label, but we're not talking about availability, we're talking about critical praise. And I think in terms of critical praise, these two are the ones that I think together occupy that place with regards to the third. Now with the fourth, this one's a little bit more straightforward. It's sort of the obvious choice in terms of the one that you hear most about. George Szell with the Cleveland Orchestra, Judith Raskin is the soprano soloist. Not much more to say there. That is the reference for the fourth. Now for the fifth and the sixth, and you might already guess who it's going to be just because I say both of them together, I would say the classic reference versions are the ones from Barbaroli with the New Philharmonia. Not much else to say there, really, especially in the case of the fifth. I think that's the one that especially is seen as iconic. The sixth is a little bit more controversial because he takes a slower tempo in that first movement, but it's still, by and large, compared to any other version out there, it's the one that you still hear the most about. And now we come to the ninth. And I'm going to start with a live recording. Actually, these are both live recordings from all the way back in 1938, and that is this iconic version from Bruno Walter with the Vienna Philharmonic. Of course, this was at the precipice of the Anschluss, so it has that sort of historical aura to it, lending to the intensity of the performance itself. And this is one that still to this day occupies this place of one of the Mahler recordings that you have to hear. Now, the other live version is from almost half a century later, and that, of course, is Herbert von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic, one of Karajan's most universally praised recordings, and definitely one of the great Mahler ninths. I could have included a couple of more, but I'm just going to stop with those two. I think those two do get on, by and large, the most mention among Mahler ninths. And then finally for Mahler, we also have to talk, of course, about his great song cycle, Das Lied von der Erde. And this one I'm going to start with one of the most famous, not only Mahler recordings, but really recordings of anything ever made, and that's this one. Kathleen Ferrier and Julius Patzak is the tenor. Ferrier is the alto, with Bruno Walter conducting the Vienna Philharmonic. Just an iconic recording. It's a little bit divisive. I think there are a lot of people who don't respond to the timbre of Ferrier's voice. It is a little bit of an acquired taste, I will admit. And of course, it's 1952 sound, so it's a little bit older. So this recording, as is the case so often with recordings of voices, it can be polarizing. But I definitely think it deserves its place still with the unique artistry that Ferrier brought to the piece. And so the question is then, do we have a more modern reference version that stands out? And I think we do. And that is the one conducted by Otto Klemperer in the early 60s with Christa Ludwig, the alto, and Fritz Wunderlich, the tenor. So you can't beat that array of soloists. It's recorded very well, and this one is also considered a reference for the piece. All right. We are just about halfway through, and I'm glad because I'm about to lose my voice. Next we come to Mendelssohn, and starting with his Symphony No. 3, and I'm going to combine that with the Midsummer Night's Dream Overture, and they are combined together in this classic recording from Peter Maag and the London Symphony, very well recorded by Decca, and pretty much a slam dunk in terms of reference versions, famous versions of these works. Now, his fourth symphony, the Italian, that one's a little bit more difficult. I almost want to punt on this one. It's difficult to say that there is really one Italian symphony version that is looked at as the iconic classic version. There are several good ones. But I would say that if there is one that I could pick out as the closest we have to a universally praised version, it would be this one. George Szell and the Cleveland Orchestra. So I'm going to count that as the reference for the Italian symphony. Now we come to the violin concerto. And first of all, Yasha, Yasha, Yasha. Gotta have Yasha. This is Heifetz with Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony. And this one's a little polarizing because he does take it so fast. But it, of course, it's virtuosically beyond reproach. But it is a little bit polarizing for that reason. But we do have a version which is slightly less fast. It's still a fairly fast version that I think can kind of co-chair with, this will be the not Heifetz choice, and that's this one from Kyung-Hwa Chung with Charles Dutoit and the Montreal Symphony. I think this is the closest we have to a modern reference version to go along with the Heifetz. And here we come again, chamber music. This one, okay, so I have to mention the Mendelssohn Octet because it is one of the great chamber music works of all time. But this one, it's really hard to pinpoint a reference version. I will say that probably the closest we have is a classic version from the 60s that was recorded on Superphone, and that's this one with the Janacek and Smetana quartets, immaculately played, very exciting, and there are several other exciting versions as well. It really is a wonderful work. I think the closest we could probably say we have to one that is considered the classic version would probably be this one. It's not it's not a slam dunk by any means. Partly maybe that one's not. It has had kind of limited availability, but I think probably that one has the best argument. Now we come to Monteverdi. Again, we're back in the Renaissance, or he's in that bridge between the Renaissance and the Baroque, and in one of the great choral masterpieces of all time, the Vespers of 1610. And this one we have a recording, again, from the 80s that I think just became the reference due to its not only fantastic performance, but the fantastic recording at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And that's John Eliot Gardner and the eponymous Monteverdi Choir with the English Baroque soloists. This is also, they also made a video for this. Incidentally, there's a young Bryn Terfel who does one of the myriad of solos throughout the piece, and as well as several other, like Michael Chance, for example. It just, there are other really good versions since then as well. There also was the Andrew Parrott version that came a little bit earlier that you can make an argument for, but I think on the whole this is the one that has gotten the most critical praise. And now we come to Mozart, the Mozart symphonies. And I'm going to start with a granddaddy version from maybe the most acclaimed Mozart interpreter of all, at least on recordings, and that's Sir Thomas Beecham. And really one of his great legacies is this set of Mozart symphonies that he recorded in the 30s with the London Philharmonic. Even though it's got old sound and it's been recorded by a ton of different groups and conductors since then, I think this one still occupies a special place to where it can be called a reference. Alongside this one, Bruno Walter with the Columbia Symphonies. Columbia Symphony, one of his later year recordings with CBS that he made in the late 50s. This is really a special set and one that has held sway for many decades, so it can be counted alongside the Beecham as well. Next, we come to the piano concertos. And I'm going to start by talking about the piano concertos as a whole, and you probably are going to guess which version of this I'm going to recommend as the reference version, and that's of course this famous one from Murray Pariah, both playing and conducting the English Chamber Orchestra. Now, if you're talking about the individual concertos, there's more debate. But if you're talking about a set of concertos, there have been other really good ones. Barenboim did a really good one as well, with also conducting the ECO. But really, this Pariah is the one that became the version critically acclaimed. Now, I do want to point out one other reference version for his most famous concerto, the 20th concerto. And that is this one, Rudolf Serkin with George Zell and the Columbia Symphony. I think you have to mention this for that number 20 D minor concerto as well. Next, we have the Sinfonia Concertante. And for this one, a relatively modern version, I think, holds sway, and that's this one. Yitzhak Perlman, Pinchas Zuckerman, Zubin Mehta, and the Israel Philharmonic. Wonderfully recorded, digital sound, widely critically praised since it came out, and I think it holds its position as a reference recording. Now, for the popular clarinet concerto, this one is another one of those where it's really hard to point to one. Part of the issue, you might say, is that you don't really have, unlike, say, the cellists with Rostropovich and Fournier, it's a little harder to find that superstar clarinetist that is a household name. But I think for the Mozart concerto, there is one version that you at least see in the most places in terms of critical praise, and that is this one with Thea King, who uses a basset clarinet, which is the way Mozart composed it so that you can hear those low notes in the score, with Jeffrey Tate in the English Chamber Orchestra. And conveniently enough, this is coupled with his probably his most popular chamber work, the Clarinet Quintet, which also, I would say, is the reference version in terms of the versions you most hear about, possibly because it's coupled with this concerto. And that's with Thea King partnered by the Gabrieli Quartet. So a really good combination recording for those two works. And then next, if we're talking about chamber works, you also have to talk about his string quintets, particularly the G minor Koelschel 516, one of his most dramatic works. And this one, there is this standard from the 70s, the Grumio Trio, Arthur Grumio, which is considered the classic, really, for these works. So that's not really too difficult to debate, especially considering we're talking about chamber works. And then finally, let's move on to the vocal works, Mozart's Requiem. You know, for so popular a work as the Mozart Requiem, you would think, as in the case of, say, the Brahms Requiem with Klemperer, that you would have that sort of go-to, obvious standard choice. You really don't with the Mozart Requiem. Now, this is one where you do have some period versions that have come out since the 80s, and then you have the modern instrument versions. It's really hard to pin. There have been a lot of good ones, but I think the closest we have to a reference version is one of those older versions, and it's this one from Karl Böhm with the Vienna Staatsopernchor and the Vienna Philharmonic. It's a little slower than we're used to today than a lot of the even not even the period performances, but even versions from Neville Mariner or Peter Schreier. You know, take the piece a little bit quicker. But this is the one that I would say that if you were to pinpoint a reference of the Requiem, this one still today gets mentioned a lot. Now we move to the operas, starting with Don Giovanni. And this one, anyone who knows about opera recordings knows that this one is a pretty clear-cut choice in terms of what gets mentioned the most. And that's, of course, the version with conducted by Carlo Maria Giulini with the Philharmonia. Eberhard Wächter is the Don. You have Joan Sutherland as Donna Anna. Elizabeth Schwarzkopf is Donna Elvira. So you have a wonderful cast, very well recorded, very well conducted by Giulini. And this is just one of those recordings that became an instant classic, and it's just held that position since. So that's a pretty clear-cut one in terms of critical acclaim. For Le Nozze di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, I'm going to go to this older classic from the 50s, conducted by Erich Kleiber, with the Vienna Philharmonic. You have Cesare Siepi as Figaro, Hilda Guedin is Susanna, Lisa della Casa is the Countess, Alfred Pohl is the Count. He's a little little raw in some sections. But despite that, this is, I think, the one that still holds its position as the classic version, if nothing else, because of Kleiber's conducting. So that is our La Nozze. And then finally, let's talk about the magic flute, die Zauberflöte. This one has, first of all, a classic old version from the 30s that I think still holds its position as a reference for the magic flute, and that's the one conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham. And this is a German recording, very very much in terms of its cast, and you've got the Berlin Philharmonic, you've got let's see who was Helga Roswanger is Tamino, Tiana Lemnitz is Pamina, Erna Berger was the Queen of the Night, Gerhard Husch is Papageno. So it's this vintage German version from the 30s, which is sort of irreplaceable in that sense, especially with the circumstances that we're about to hit. This was recorded in 1938, and you have a British conductor conducting, so it was one of those that almost has a quasi historical kind of circumstance hovering in the background as well. Now, again, the question is then, do we have a better sounding stereo reference version? And the answer is yes and no. We have two that I think vie for that position, without either one being considered perfect. First, there's the Klemperer, and then you also have, I'll mention the other one, is the Karl Böhm version. And the sort of garden variety synopsis is that if you value the women more, you want the Klemperer, and if you value the men more, you want the Karl Böhm. Karl Böhm has, first of all, Fritz Wunderlich as Tamino, and that's sort of the god voice of all Taminos. You also have Fischer Dieskau is Papageno. But then here you have Gundula Janowitz as Pamina, and you have Lucia Popp as the Queen of the Night. And then Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and Christa Ludwig are two of the three ladies, the smaller parts. So it's pretty star-studded. So you might say that your perfect Frankenstein version would be to somehow combine these two together. They're both very good, and really it's hard to make an argument for one over the other. But I think they can both be considered co-references for stereo versions of the Magic Flute. Okay, so now we are done with Mozart, and we move to Mussorgsky and his masterpiece, Pictures in an Exhibition. This one's pretty straightforward. Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony, one of those living stereo recordings from the 50s, also coupled with A Night on the Bare Mountain. Pretty much has held sway as the reference version. Another fairly easy choice is for Orff's Carmina Burana. This one's very easy. Eugen Joachim and it's the Berlin Opern, what is it? The Deutschen Oper Berlin Chorus and Orchestra, and you have Gundula Janowitz again as the soprano soloist, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as the baritone, and wonderfully conducted by Eugen Joachim. So pretty much has held sway all these decades. Next, we have a Renaissance composer, Palestrina, and his masterpiece, Missa Pape Marcelli. And here we go again, the Tallis Scholars. This is also valuable because it's combined with that sort of Renaissance top 40 hit, the Allegri Miserere. This is also the iconic version of that as well. These were recorded around, I think, 1980. So that is your Missa Pape, the Tallis Scholars. Next we have Prokofiev. And first we're going to discuss his Symphony No. 5. And this one's a pretty clear favorite. Herbert von Karajan with the Berlin Philharmonic from the late 60s. Pretty much universally critically acclaimed. That's all we got to say about that one. For the Piano Concerto No. 3 of Prokofiev, I think we can safely put this one in the reference category. Martha Argerich with Claudio Abbado and the Berlin Philharmonic from the late 60s. This is the coupling that comes with the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto No. 1, which is my top choice for that work with Charles Dutoit. You can also get, there's an originals, I think that couples it with Ravel Piano Concerto. And then finally, his ballet masterpiece, Romeo and Juliet. This one, I think, by and large, the one that you could say is the most referential is this recording from the early 70s. Lauren Mizell with the Cleveland Orchestra, immaculately recorded, very virtuosic. My favorite recording as well. And now we come to Puccini. We're back to opera. And you know, opera is a field that can often spar a lot of debate. And a lot of these, the debate won't be really on, you know, how could you choose that version? It's more like, how can you choose that version and not include this one and this one? So we'll see how this goes. I think for La Boheme, the classic version is the one conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham, with Victoria de Los Angeles as Mimi and UC Bierling as Rodolfo. This one's been a classic since it was made. You could make a case for a couple of others joining it, but I think by and large this one holds sway. Now for Madame Butterfly, there are three versions I could have put all together. There's the version conducted by Barbaroli with Renata Scatto. There's also Mirella Freni with Herbert von Karajan. But I'm going to say for this one, the one that just by a whisker nudges its way into the reference position is this one, Renata Tebaldi, conducted by Tullio Serafin with the Rome Santa Cecilia Orchestra. Carlo Bergonzi as the tenor, as Pinkerton. This is the one that I think among all the butterflies, just by a little hair, even though it's not unanimous, she actually had not sung the role on stage before recording it, and to a lot of people sounds a little bit too mature for the role, but it definitely sings gorgeously. I would say that this is the version that has the most argument to be the reference. You may disagree, and you're free to say so. Now for Tosca, come on, we know which one this is. Maria Callas as Tosca, with Giuseppe Di Stefano as Mario Cavaradossi, Tito Gobbi as a wonderful menacing Scarpia, and really the cherry on top is the conducting of Victor de Sabata. This is widely seen as the greatest opera recording of all time. I fervently agree with that sentiment. I have loved this ever since I first heard it. This is the slam dunk of all slam dunks. So that is your reference for Tosca. It was recorded, incidentally, in mono sound in 1953. That's the one knock against it. But despite that, and actually it's fairly good mono, and they've done as much as they could with this famous recording to remaster it and remaster it. But it should tell you something that it's still held its position after all these decades. And then finally, for Turandot, I think this one is a fairly straightforward one too. Zubin Mehta's version with the London Philharmonic, with Joan Sutherland as Turandot and Luciano Pavarotti as the Calaf. Wonderfully recorded and obviously star-studded. Pretty difficult to compete with this one, at least in terms of reference versions. Okay, so that's Puccini. I'm trying to remember where we are in the alphabet. We are to the letter R. We're getting closer to the end. And let's start with, we're talking about Rachmaninoff, and let's start first with his Symphony No. 2. This is one where I don't know that there really is a reference. It's more like, a default type of thing. What gets talked about more often than others, and especially what gets talked about most loudly. Ormandy did a great version. Kurt Zandling did a really good version. But I think the one that has gotten the most acclaim is this one, André Previn with the London Symphony from the early 70s. Very lushly played and lushly recorded. Now, my favorite is the Rojdestvenski myself, which is also has its fair amount of praise. But I think on the whole, the Previn is the one that has gotten the most attention. And next, let's talk about his two most famous piano concertos, number 2 and number 3. And first, you have to talk about, as a reference, Rachmaninoff's own recordings. Not just because they have the authority, but in terms of his incredible virtuosity. They definitely have occupied that position. They were recorded about a decade apart, actually. The second was with Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1929. And then I think it was about a dozen years later that he recorded the third with Eugene Ormandy, also with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Now, we do have, I think, a couple of stereo versions for each work that can also be considered references in the modern times. One is this one for the second. Sviatoslav Richter with Stanislaw Wisłocki and the Warsaw Philharmonic. This was recorded in I think 1959. Obviously, Richter has that incredible virtuosity. He's also quite a probing artist, so he's very individual. This one occupies a haloed place. And then for the third, this one's a little tricky. Personally, I think the Vladimir Horowitz live Carnegie Hall version with John Barbaroli in 1941 is maybe the greatest concerto recording of all time, but it's really badly recorded. It really is, and it is a darling of critics in some spheres, but I would not say all, partly because of the recording quality. And then he had later versions as well that have gotten a lot of attention, but I don't know that they are enough of a reference to supplant this one. Martha Argerich with Riccardo Chailly and the Berlin Radio Symphony. This came out in the early 80s and really caused a sensation. And I would say that the closest we have to a modern rock third reference version is this one from Argerich. Next, we have the Ravel Piano Concerto. And this one is a very famous, iconic version. Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli on piano with Ettore Gracis and the Philharmonia from the late 50s. Just a real classic. That middle movement, it's to die for. That gorgeous slow movement. Now, you could have made an argument for Saint-Saëns-François as well as a co-reference. I'm going to say that this one is so highly regarded that I'm going to say that this one kind of stands alone, just barely above the François recording. Now, for his orchestral masterpiece, Ravel's Daphne et Chloe, this one is really more of a two-sided debate that I can't really settle. And you probably will know which ones these are. On the one hand, we have the Charles Munch Boston Symphony recording from the mid-50s, and then a few years later, Pierre Monteux and the London Symphony, both considered among the greatest orchestral recordings ever made of anything, really. And so it's really kind of impossible to separate them out. They do kind of complement each other well, I think. There's a little bit more warmth with the Monteux and a little bit more brilliance with the Munch. So, you might as well get them both, right? And then before we leave Ravel, let's talk about his piano masterpiece, Gaspard de la Nuit. And we have a modern classic, well, modern-ish, at least it's digital for this one, and that's Ivo Pogorelic, recorded in the 80s. This is one of those classics since it was made type recordings, and I think a pretty straightforward reference recording for that work. Now we come to one of my favorite works since I was a kid, Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. This one's hard for the opposite reason of a lot of these others. This one, there are too many classic recordings of Scheherazade that it's tempting to go with 3 or 4 or even 5 perhaps. But I'm going to say, even though it's not my favorite version, and I talk about the Scheherazade in my own video on this, I'm going to say there is a version that you can say is the reference in terms of its universal regard and just how widely praised it is, and that's this one, Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony, recorded in 1960. Fantastic recording quality, and just still occupies this place that I think, if there is a reference among all these other references, including Beecham, Stokowski, Kondershin, which is my favorite. I was very tempted to include the Kondershin as a co-reference, but if we're being honest, I think the Reiner is the one that gets the most mention. So that's Scheherazade. Next we come to Saint-Saëns' Organ Symphony, the Symphony No. 3. This one's kind of a slam dunk. Old question, right? This is Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony, recorded in the late 50s. So fairly straightforward on that one. And we also have now Rossini, his iconic Barber of Seville, Il Barbiere di Siviglia. And this one, it's not as much of a slam dunk as, say, Tosca, but I think by and large the Callas recording, with also with Tito Gobbi as Figaro, is the one that is the most praised. Conducted by Aceo Galliera, and this is with the Philharmonia. Late 50s, I believe. Is this one stereo or mono, actually? Yeah, it is stereo, late 50s. Excellent recording, excellent performance, and one that's stood the proverbial test of time. And now we are to the letter S, and we are starting with Franz Schubert and his unfinished symphony, Symphony No. 8. And maybe it should be called the unfinished reference recordings, because this one is like the Mendelssohn Italian Symphony. It's a little hard to find one that stands out from the rest. I would say that there are two, and sort of conducted in contrasting styles, recorded not too long apart from each other, that get the most critical attention. One is from our old buddy Carlos Kleiber with the Vienna Philharmonic, recorded in the late 70s. Of course, anything Kleiber does is going to get attention, and this is more on the as Kleiber tended to do, it's on the more kind of dramatic, kind of more quicker paced, and then you have this version from Giuseppe Sinopoli and the Philharmonia, recorded just a few years later. That this is really considered maybe Sinapoli's greatest recording, also coupled with a very good Mendelssohn Italian Symphony. And Sinopoli took his time a little bit more with it. It's a little bit more probing. So the two kind of complement each other in that regard. I think if there are reference recordings for the unfinished symphony, these are probably the two closest that I could center on. And then for the ninth, for this one, I think we have an older recording in mono, although not too far back mono, recorded in 1951, that has held sway all these decades to where I think you can call it the reference still today. And that's Wilhelm Furtwängler's recording with the Berlin Philharmonic, one of the most universally praised of all of Furtwängler's recordings, not just for the interpretation, but also the sound quality. And I think this is still today the Symphony No. 9 of reference choice, although there are certainly many other really good ones. Now we come to Schubert's chamber music, and I'm going to start with his Trout Quintet. This is a version which, strangely enough, is harder to find these days, but I think is still considered the classic version. Clifford Curzon, with members of the Vienna Octet. Recorded in the late 50s fairly well with Decca. Again, with chamber music, it's a little harder to center on a particular classic standard version, but I think this is the closest we have with the Trout Quintet. With the string quintet, which is considered by most people to be Schubert's masterpiece, one of the greatest masterpieces in the entire chamber music genre, really. This one's difficult. It's really difficult to center on one reference version. And actually, I would say that the closest we have are these two recordings that both are recorded in mono, one studio and one live. But I think they both are so valued artistically that they can be considered reference choices still today. One is the Hollywood String Quartet version from 1951, coupled incidentally with their fantastic recording of Schoenberg's Verklärte Nacht. By the way, why don't they put out like EMI? You should put out a Hollywood String Quartet box tomorrow. I mean, this was one of the greatest chamber music groups in recorded history, and you have to dig and find them on Testament, and they're really hard to find, and it shouldn't be so hard to find. Just please do it. Okay. Little request there. And then also, okay, going now to another reference version for the string quintet. Just from the next year, we have this live version from the Partitas Festival, Pablo Casal's festival. And the five soloists are Isaac Stern and Alexander Schneider on violin, Milton Katims is the violist, and then Casals and Paul Tortelier on cello. So a star-studded cast and just an incredible performance. I mean, it's not often that we have a reference recording that's a live recording, so that just tells you how highly regarded this is, that it's so widely praised. So I would say these are the two that we have. It's not a slam dunk. Preferably, we would have a better sounding reference version, and there have been a lot of really good ones. It's just harder to find one that stands out from the field. So I think we revert back to these two. Now, one more chamber work for Schubert. Of course, I'm not going to leave out the string quartet number 12, The Death and the Maiden. Oh, did I say 12? I mean 14. The Death and the Maiden Quartet. And first we have the old granddaddy version from the 30s, just like with the Beethoven string quartets, the Busch Quartet. This one still is today considered artistically, one you have to hear. And then for modern times, or stereo times at least, I would say this version from the 60s, the Quartetto Italiano. This one is also considered an iconic version. Next we have, I'm going to discuss his most famous piano work, the final piano sonata number 21, or D 960 if you're into the you have Mozart, you have Kerschel numbers. For Bach, you have BWV numbers. Everyone else, you have opus numbers, but with Schubert, it's the D. The D960. And for this one, we do have, again, a granddaddy version. And this is going to be just like the Beethoven sonatas. You have Arthur Schnabel's recording from the late 30s, which is artistically, just like with the Beethoven sonatas, universally regarded as artistically insightful. And then you have, just like with the Beethoven sonatas, you have Wilhelm Kempff as the later version. This is a stereo recording from the 60s that is also really highly regarded. And this is such a wonderful sonata. It's had a lot of other great recordings as well. But I would say these two are probably the two kind of reference standout-y types. So that's the piano sonata. One more work for Schubert is his iconic song cycle, Winterreise. And for this one, we have, I think, two. We have, first of all, Hans Hotter with Gerald Moore. This was recorded in the 50s. It's barely mono. I think it was recorded, just like a year before the advent of stereo. But it sounds pretty good. Very highly regarded. And then you have to have one of the Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau versions. The question is which one? And that's a very hard question to answer. I think it really came down to a question of whether you choose the Gerald Moore version from the early 60s on EMI or the one with George Demus on Deutsche Grammophon a couple years later. I'm going to go with the Demus. Maybe because it's slightly better recorded, maybe because it's issued as part of the originals. You hear about this a little bit more often. It definitely caught Fischer-Dieskau's voice at its absolute peak. So you can't go wrong with that one or the Moore. Or, of course, the Hans Hotter version from a decade earlier. All right, now we come to Schumann. And we already discussed his piano concerto along with the Grieg. For that one, Dino Lipati with Herbert von Karajan. For his chamber masterpiece, the piano quintet, I'm going to go back to the recording that I discussed as the reference for the Brahms piano quintet, and that's this one. Arthur Rubinstein and the Guarneri Quartet. Again, it's the chamber music field. It's not as much of a slam dunk as you might have with the other repertoire, but I think that's the closest we have to a reference for that. For his piano masterpiece, well, one of his piano masterpieces, he was a fantastic composer for solo piano. But if we were talking about one that really stands out, Kreisleriana, this version from Horowitz, I believe it's from the mid-'60s, is just one of the timeless classics of piano recordings. And then finally, for Schumann, his great song cycle, the Dichterliebe. This one has had a lot of great recordings, but there is that one tenor that everyone flocks to whenever he appears on a CD, Fritz Wunderlich. And this really is one of his great recordings. His voice is beautifully captured. It also comes with some of the most popular Schubert songs as well. So great memento of Wunderlich, who of course died tragically before he could leave us more great recordings, but definitely this one is considered one of the iconic ones. All right, now we come to Shostakovich. And I'm going to discuss the two most popular Shostakovich symphonies, starting with the fifth. And this one, there are a lot of really highly regarded ones. I could have included Maravinsky, I could have included Andrei Previn, but I think the one that gets the most mention is Leonard Bernstein, his 1959 New York Philharmonic recording with that blazing fast finale. I think by and large this one occupies that position for the fifth. And then for the 10th, I think you got to go with Herbert von Karajan, his digital recording with the Berlin Philharmonic. Even though we also have really good ones from like Maravinsky, this one is the most critically praised. And then finally for Shostakovich, his string quartets, especially when you're talking about his string quartets, the one that stands out is the eighth. But it's usually it's recorded as part of the entire set. So I'm going to talk about the string quartet cycles, and starting with this iconic cycle from the '60s that was recorded before he had finished composing them all. So it's only 13 of the 15, but it's this one from the Borden Quartet. Now they did record it later for EMI in the 70s when they did do all 15. But this one is the Borden Quartet version that's considered the best one artistically. We do, however, have another cycle that does include all 15 that is also an iconic cycle of Shostakovich's string quartets, and that's from this British quartet, the Fitzwilliam Quartet, recorded in the late 70s. I'm going to say this one is highly regarded enough that it is a co-reference alongside the Borodin. Okay, that gets us through Shostakovich, getting closer to the end. Now let's talk about Sibelius symphonies. His two most popular, the second and the fifth, as well as one that has become more popular lately, the seventh. But let's start first with the second. And this one, again, I just couldn't choose between these two. They're both very highly regarded, recorded fairly close to each other in the 60s. One is John Barbaroli with the Royal Philharmonic, and the other is George Zell with the Concertgebouw. I think these are both so strongly regarded that they can be co-references. And then for the fifth, we also have two versions from opposite sides of the Atlantic. One is Leonard Bernstein with the New York Philharmonic from the early 60s, and then Herbert von Karajan with the Berlin Philharmonic from the mid-60s. Both of these really highly acclaimed. I tend to prefer the Bernstein. I consider it one of the great Sibelius recordings of all time, as I talked about in my video. But if we're being honest, the Karajan is still so highly regarded that I don't think you can exclude that one from the conversation either. And then we come to the seventh, and there is this recording from 1935. Serge Koussevitzky with the BBC Symphony, one of the iconic Sibelius recordings of all time. And I'm going to say that in this case, this one is so highly acclaimed, and there's really a lack of consensus since then on any of the recordings that have come after, although there have been many really, really, really great recordings. I'm going to say that this one retains its position as the reference recording of the Sibelius 7th, despite the old sound. It really is a fantastic performance, but you have to make allowances for the sound, of course. And then lastly, for Sibelius, you have to talk, of course, about his iconic violin concerto. And this is one where I really think, more than maybe any other concerto, Heifetz's version is most universally praised. Really, the question here is this version versus his version from the 30s with Thomas Beecham. I think by just a small margin, and probably because of the sound quality, this one with Walter Handel and the Chicago Symphony is the closest we have to a reference version of the Sibelius concerto. Now we come to Smetana and his orchestral masterpiece, Ma Vlast. And Ma Vlast is one where you have, I think, two really historical, iconic versions that both are so revered that you have to include them both. One is from the 50s with Václav Talic conducting the Czech Philharmonic, which it really is a fantastic interpretation and pretty good sound for its time, even though it's mono. And then this one, the historic circumstances of Raphael Kubelik returning in 1990 to conduct the Czech Philharmonic. Really exciting, and the circumstances are very emotional. So both of these, I think you have to talk about both of these as being the references for Ma Vlast. Now we come to Richard Strauss and his tone poems, starting with Ein Alpensymphonie, the Alpine Symphony. And this is one that comes from one of the most highly regarded, complete cycles of Strauss orchestral works. This is maybe considered the pick of the litter. This recording by Rudolf Kempe and the Staatskapelle Dresden from the early 70s. Now, there have been other really good Alpine symphonies, but I think by and large this is the one that gets the most critical praise. Next, Also sprach Zarathustra, the 2001 Space Odyssey music. This one, I'm going to say there are two, because they're both so iconic in their own right that I don't think you can exclude either one from the conversation. Of course, the first one is this one from the mid-50s, Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony, considered demonstration recording quality at its time and still sounding really good. And then this one, Herbert von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic from the mid-70s, that is also fantastic, both sonically and in terms of the performance. Two iconic performances that I think both have to be considered for this work. And then when we're talking about Ein Heldenleben, I think first you have to go all the way back to 1928. You have to talk about Wilhelm Mengelberg and the New York Philharmonic, very widely praised and still revered today, such that it retains its place, even though we also have this classic version, once again, Fritz Reiner with the Chicago Symphony, coupled with the Also sprach from the 50s, wonderfully recorded. I think these are your two Heldenlebens of reference. Okay, now let's talk about a few more tone poems. Basically, Till, Dawn and Tod, Till Eulenspiegel's Lustige Streiche, Don Juan, and Tod und Verklärung, Death and Transfiguration. And this one, I think we have to go with George Zell and the Cleveland Orchestra. These recordings from the late 50s, just considered classics, and still setting a standard today. You could maybe make an argument for Karajan on the Tod und Verklärung. The question would be which one, 70s versus the 80s. I like the one from the 70s myself. But I think, especially if you're going to combine them with the other two, the Zell recordings are the ones that hold sway. Now we come to another one of those hotly debated vocal recordings. His masterwork for solo voice and orchestra, the Four Last Songs. This is one where, kind of like I was saying with Scheherazade, there are many classics of this one. And do you choose all of them, or do you try to center on just one? I'm going to center on just one, because I think this is the one that still gets the most kind of awe-inspired, I'm not worthy type of acclaim, and that's this one. Elizabeth Schwarzkopf with George Zell, and I think it's the Berlin Radio Symphony Orchestra, I believe. It recorded in the late 60s. Schwarzkopf competes with herself because she did it with Lovro von Matetic, or was it Otto Ackermann? I think it was Ackermann, a decade earlier. And then you also have Lisa Della Casa, you have Gundula Janowitz with Karajan, you have Jessie Norman, her fabulous version from the 80s. And so I understand anyone who says, how could you leave that one off? Well, I just think this is the one that by a whisker, as great as all those other ones are, this one has such iconic status that I'm going to call this one the reference. Likewise, for Der Rosenkavalier, I think you again have to go with Schwarzkopf. Her version, where she's the Marschallin, conducted by Herbert von Karajan, with Christa Ludwig as Octavian. This is also one of the classics of all classics, even though there have been other really good Rosenkavaliers, especially the Kleiber version from a few years earlier. This is really the one that's sort of considered the iconic classic. And then finally we have his opera Salome. This one's pretty much a slam dunk. Birgit Nilsson as Salome, conducted by Georg Schulte with the Vienna Philharmonic, fabulously recorded and just electric and pretty much a slam dunk in terms of reference classics. Now let's talk about Stravinsky. First, The Rite of Spring and Petrushka. They're coupled often enough together that I think you can combine them in the conversation. And I'm going to first say that in terms of a reference, you have to start with the composer's own version from 1960, even though it's a little bit polarizing because for some people, they're like, oh, well, he wasn't a real conductor and he doesn't, he's not dramatic enough and so on. Maybe so. But whenever you look at a list of great recordings of these works, you always, he's always included in there, and for many, it's still the version, the best version of all. So I'm going to say that Stravinsky himself is a reference, and then the question becomes: is there among all the great versions that have come before and after one that you could pick out? Because you had a couple of Dorati recordings, you had Markievicz did The Rite of Spring, at least by itself, Pierre Monteux, Leonard Bernstein. I think you can, and that is this recording. Pierre Boulez with the Cleveland Orchestra in The Rite of Spring and the New York Philharmonic in Petrushka. I think if there is one that stands out among the not by the composer versions, it's this one. Now for the Firebird, it's a little bit more straightforward. Anatole Dorati, London Symphony, Mercury and Living Presence recording, fabulous recording, very exciting performance. I think fairly non-controversial, the standard for that. Now we are to the letter T, and let's go back to the Renaissance. And Thomas Tallis, and one of the greatest hits of all Renaissance hits, Spem in Alium, his 40-part choral work. And surprise, surprise, it's the Tallis Scholars. I bet you didn't expect that. Of course, it's this recording from 1984, although there are lots of other really, really, really great ones. This is the one that I think still gets the... By a little bit. There are some really, really good ones that have come out, since this recording. But I think this one still retains its position as the reference. Next, we come to Tchaikovsky and his three most popular symphonies. I'm going to discuss them as a set, 4, 5, and 6. And you know what this one's going to be. Of course, Evgeny Maravinsky, this iconic recording from 1960 with the Leningrad Philharmonic, recorded very well. There have been a lot of great recordings of these works, especially the Symphony Number 6, the Pathétique. But I think this is the one that became the classic and has retained its position as the classic after all these decades. Now for the Piano Concerto Number 1, this one is interesting because you have a version that is almost as famous for being it's almost as famous for being overrated as it is famous for being great. And that is, of course, one of the most famous recordings ever made of classical music. The version with Van Cliburn, conducted by Kirill Kondrashin in the RCA Orchestra. Of course, the famous story of Cliburn winning the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow. And then they came over here and recorded it. By the way, this cover, it's such a iconic cover. It's almost to classical music what the Abbey Road cover, with the Beatles, or the Pet Sounds with the Beach Boys is to pop music. It's just such a famous recording that even this image is kind of like, that one. Now the thing about it though is, it is universally praised. However, I would say that more often than not, you hear a lot of people saying, yeah, it's so famous because of its circumstances, but was the actual performance that great? And the thing is, what you'll most often hear is that it wasn't as great as its acclaim, maybe due to the fame and circumstances. But the issue is, what's the alternative? What is the more critically acclaimed version than this one? And honestly, I think that is such a wide open debate between other versions that this one still retains its position as the reference. Now, for the violin concerto, we first have to go back to Heifetz. This is coupled with the Brahms concerto. It's with the same conductor and orchestra, Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony, recorded in the 50s. It's one of the pieces that Heifetz was most known for. But I think you also have to include, next to Heifetz, again, David Oistrakh. And the question is which Oistrakh, because he, like just with the Brahms, he also did it with Konwiczny on Deutsche Grammophon a few years earlier. But I think by a small margin, this version with Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra from 1959 is the one that has gotten the bulk of acclaim. So just like with the Brahms, I think you got to go with Heifetz and Oistrakh as your reference recordings. All right, next, let's talk about, this will be easy, 1812 Overture. Dorati. Handel Dorati, Minneapolis Symphony, 1958. Almost as famous, probably more famous for it's just the recording technology with the Mercury Living Presence, but a pretty easy choice for the 1812 Overture. And then for the ballet suites, we have this recording, Mstislav Rostropovich and the Berlin Philharmonic from the late 70s, beautifully recorded and played, pretty much universally regarded. Okay, now we are to the V's, Verdi, starting with Verdi's Requiem. This has also had a slew of great recordings going back to the time of Toscanini. But I think that this recording is pretty uncontroversial in terms of being the reference choice. Carlo Maria Giulini, the Philharmonia Orchestra and Chorus, powerhouse quartet of soloists, including Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, Christa Ludwig, Nikolai Gedda, and Nikolai Jarov. Very famous recording and still highly regarded today. Now for the operas, for Aida, this one is not a slam dunk. There was the Callas version. There is Montserrat Caballé did a wonderful version conducted by Riccardo Muti. But I think this is probably gets the most plethora of consensus opinion in its favor, and that's the one with conducted by Janelle Perlia, the Rome Opera House. Zinka Milanov is Aida, Jussi Björling is Radames. Amoramnis is Leonard Warren. And then you have Boris Christoph as Ramnis. So a really good cast, fairly well recorded for its time and in the mid-50s. I think this retains its place among Aidas. Then Otello. Okay, this one, I got to go with this version from the 40s, the Toscanini version, with Ramon Vinay, an excellent Otello, and then the Iago is Giuseppe Valdengo. They're just electric, and the combination of Toscanini's conducting. It's not too bad sounding for its time. Of course, it's famously dry, as Toscanini tended to be. But this is one of the iconic Toscanini recordings. It's one of the iconic opera recordings, and I think it still retains its place as the reference today, even though there have been a bunch of other really good Otellos, John Vickers, Placido Domingo. You could easily slide them in next to this one, but I think this one is so iconic, I'm going to just keep it here on its own. And then for Rigoletto, here we go again with Callas and her band of friends. Giuseppe Di Stefano, Tito Gobbi, Tullio Serafin. And this is, I think, the La Scala version. Yeah, it's with La Scala. Recorded in mono, but fairly good sounding mono. And probably on the whole considered to be the iconic Rigoletto recording. Now, La Traviata. This one is it's almost kind of famous how difficult it is to center on one Traviata recording. Basically, the word on the streets is that there is no perfect Traviata, and part of the issue is that it seems the consensus is in agreement that the great Violetta was Maria Callas. It was considered maybe her signature role, but we don't really have a studio stereo recording showing her, sounding the best. So we have to kind of debate among the different air checks. And by and large, I would say this one gets the most critical praise, the one conducted by Carlo Maria Giulini. This was recorded, it was the La Scala version. I think it was recorded in Lisbon. But it is with La Scala, and it's got Giuseppe Di Stefano as Germont. So it's a really good performance, but it's not so great recording quality. But that's how highly regarded Callas is in this role, that even despite the sound quality, it's one of the reference recordings. And then for a good sounding recording, there's a lot of debate over it, but I would say that if there is one, it's probably the closest we have is this one, conducted again by Carlos Kleiber, so that's always going to give it a little bit of an extra push. Ileana Kotrubas plays Violetta, and Placido Domingo is Germont, and then you have Kleiber's conducting added to that. So it's still a heavy debate, I would say, but if you were going to center on one stereo version, it would probably be this one. Next, we have Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Okay, this is a difficult one. Again, you have the modern instrument versus period instrument debate, and this has been recorded so many times, and there's just a slew of fantastic recordings. I'm going to say that the one from Neville Marriner and the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields with Alan Loveday as the soloist from 1969 is probably the one that has retained its position the most after all the decades, even though you have these kind of trailblazing, really fast period performances since then. This one still has the most critical praise in its favor. And now we come to the final composer in this survey, Wagner. Let's start with Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. This is one that is famously lucky on record. So it's hard to choose one reference recording. You're tempted to choose 4 or 5. But I will say that, particularly lately, there is sort of a coalescence of critical opinion in favor of one recording above all the others, and it's this one. It's a little bit hard to find. It's the one conducted by Raphael Kubelik. It's with the it's with the Bavaria Radio Symphony Orchestra and Chorus. Thomas Stewart is portraying Hans Sachs, and it's just really pretty much universally regarded in terms of the performance quality, even amongst all these other great versions that have come before it. And really, the hardest thing about it is just the availability. It's what label is this? I don't even know what. Let's see. This is the Arts Archives, I believe, is the name of this label. So it's a little harder to find, but in terms of critical consensus, I think it is by a small margin the pick for Meistersingers. Parsifal is a little bit easier. We have that one conductor, that's sort of married to this piece. I mean, we have like I think a dozen versions by him, maybe even more, conducting it at Bayreuth, and they're all at Bayreuth. They're all live. The most famous of which is this one. So Hans Knappertsbusch with Jess Thomas as Parsifal. This is his 1962 Bayreuth recording. Pretty good sounding recording. I tend to prefer actually the 1951 version, even though it's not quite as well recorded. But this one is definitely the best recorded, and so it's gotten the most critical praise. So not a very difficult choice for Parsifal. Now, the ring cycle, das Ring der Ring des Nibelungen. And this one's pretty easy in terms of fame. And that's the Georg Solti version, one of the most famous classical recordings of all time. A little bit like the Clyburn Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto No. 1. This one's almost as famous for how many people say it's overrated as it is for being rated so highly. But what's the old saying? You have to be rated to be overrated. It's the ring cycle. I mean, there's always going to be big debate, and it's like a 15-hour opera, 4 operas. So it's already difficult enough to, first of all, to listen to an entire cycle, much less grade it. But this one is it's definitely a landmark in recording history, and the one that by and large still holds its place. And then finally we come to Wagner's iconic Tristan und Isolde, and this one we're going to start with a mono version that was a reference since it was first came out, and I think still retains its place. The one conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler, with one of the most famous Wagnerians of all time, Kirsten Flagstad as Isolde, and Ludwig Suthaus is Tristan. This is considered Wagner from as close as you can get to the horse's mouth in terms of interpretation, and it's pretty good sound quality, even though it's mono. However, we do have a stereo version from Bayreuth that also is considered iconic, and that's this one with Karl Böhm from Bayreuth in the late 60s. With Birgit Nilsson as Isolde and Wolfgang Wingassen as Tristan. So I think this one can also serve as a co-reference. As iconic as this one is, that shows you how good this one is too. So they both occupy those positions. All right, that's it. How about that? An entire survey of the core classical music repertoire, their most famous recordings, as close as we can get to a consensus, your sort of referential starting point. I hope you've enjoyed this, and feel free, as always, to comment anything you agree with or disagree with. And I wish you all happy listening and a great day.